Chapter 1 of Uller Uprising. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Uller Uprising by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 1. Commander-in-Chief, Front and Center. General Carlos von Schlichten threw his cigarette away, flexed his hands in his gloves, and set his monocle more firmly in his eye, stepping forward as the footsteps on the stairway behind him ceased and the other officers emerged from the squat flint keep. Captain Cazabiel, the post CO, big chocolate-brown Brigadier General Themistocles Mazangwe, Little Colonel Hideyoshi O'Leary. Far in front of him, to the left, the horizon was lost in the cloud bank over Takkad Sea. Directly in front, and to the right, the brown and gray and black flint mountains sawed into the sky until they vanished in the distance. Unseen below, the old caravan trail climbed one side of the pass and slid down the other, a sheer 500 feet below the parapet and the two-corner catapult platforms which now mounted 90mm guns. On the little 100-foot square parade ground in front of the keep, his air car was parked and the soldiers were assembled. 10 or 12 of them were Terrans, a couple of lieutenants, sergeants, gunners, technicians, the sergeant driver and corporal gunner of his own car. The other 50-odd were Ulleran natives. They stood erect on stumpy legs and broad six-toed feet. They had 4 arms apiece, one pair from true shoulders and the other connected to a pseudo-pelvis midway down the torso. Their skins were slate gray and rubbery, speckled with pinhead-sized bits of quartz that had been formed from perspiration, for their body tissues were silicone instead of carbon hydrogen. Their narrow heads were unpleasantly saurian. They had small double-lidded red eyes and slit-like nostrils and wide mouths filled with opalescent teeth. Except for their belts and equipment, they were completely naked. The uniform consisted of the emblem of the Chartered Uller Company, stencil painted on chests and backs. Clothing to them was unnecessary, either for warmth or modesty. As to the former, they were cold-blooded and could stand a temperature range of from 120 to -100 centigrade. Von Schlichten had seen them sleeping in the open with their bodies covered with frost or freezing rain. He had also seen them wade through boiling water. As to the second, they had practically no sex inhibitions. They were all of the same gender, true functional hermaphrodites. Any individual among them could bear young or fertilize the ova of any other individual. 15 years ago, when he had come to Uller as a former Terran Federation captain, newly commissioned colonel in the army of the Uller Company, it had taken some time before he had become accustomed to the detailing of a non-com and a couple of privates out of each platoon for babysitting duty. At least, though, they didn't have the squaw trouble around army posts on Uller that they had on Thor, where he had last been stationed. An airjeep coming in out of the sun circled the crag-top fort and let down onto the terrace next to von Schlichten's command car. It carried a bristle of 15mm machine guns, and 2 of the 8 50mm rocket tubes on either side were empty and freshly smoke-stained. The door glass canopy slid back, and the 2-man crew, lieutenant driver and sergeant gunner, jumped out. Von Schlichten knew them both. "Lieutenant Kendall, Sergeant Garcia," he greeted. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." Both saluted in the informal hell-with-rank, we're-all-human manner of Terran soldiers on extraterrestrial duty, and returned the greeting. "How's the Jeel situation?" he asked, then nodded toward the fired rocket tubes. "I see you had some shooting." "Yes, sir," the lieutenant said. "2 bands of them. We sighted the first coming up the eastern side of the mountain, about 2 miles this side of the Blue Springs. We got about half of them with MG fire, and the rest dived into a big rock crevice. We had to use 2 rockets on them, and then had to let down and pot a few of them with our pistols. We caught the second band in that little punch bowl place about a mile this side of Zortok's old fort. There were only 6 of them. They were bunched together, feeding off one of their own gang, I'd say. The way we've been keeping them up in the high rocks, they've been eating inside the family quite a bit lately. We let them have 2 rockets. No survivors. Not many very big pieces, in fact. We let down at Zortolk's for a beer after that, and Captain Martinelli told us that one of his jeeps caught what he thinks was the same band that was down off the mountain night before last, and ate those peasants on Prince Neeldink's estate. Gad, I'm glad to hear that. There'd been a perfect hell of a flap about that business. Before the Terrans came to Uller, it was a good year when not more than 500 farm folk would be killed and eaten by Jeel cannibals. The incident of 2 nights ago had been the first of its kind in almost 6 months. But the nobleman whose serfs had been eaten was practically accusing the company of responsibility for the crime. I'll see that Neeldink is informed. The more you do for these damned geeks, the more they expect from you. When you get your vehicle re-ammoed, Lieutenant, suppose you buzz back to where you machine-gunned that first gang. If there are any more around, they'll have moved in for the free meal by now. This breakdown of the Jeel's taboo against eating fellow tribesmen was one of the best things he'd heard from the cannibal extermination project for some time. He turned to Themistocles M'zangwe. "In about 2 weeks, get a little task force together. Say 10 combat cars, about 20 air jeeps, and a battalion of Kragan rifles in troop carriers. Oh yes, and this good-for-nothing Konkrook Fencibles outfit of Prince Jaizerd's. They can be used for beaters and to block escape routes." He turned back to Lieutenant Kendall and Sergeant Garcia. "Good work, boys. And if the synchro photos show that any of that first bunch got away, don't feel too badly about it. These Jeels can hide on the top of a pool table." He climbed into the command car, followed by Themistocles M'zangwe and Hideyoshi O'Leary. Sergeant Harry Quong and Corporal Hassan Bogdanoff took their places on the front seat. The car lifted, turned to nose into the wind, and rose in a slow spiral. Below, the fort grew smaller, a flat-topped rectangle of masonry overlooking the pass, a gun covering each approach, and 2 more on the square keep to cover the rocky hogback on which the fort had been built, with the flagpole between them. Once that pole had lifted a banner of ragged black marsh-flopper skin, bearing the device of the Kragan Reaver chieftain whose family had built the castle. Now it carried a neat rectangle of blue bunting, emblazoned with the wreathed globe of the Terran Federation, and below that the blue-gray pennant which bore the vermilion trademark of the chartered Uller Company. "Where now, sir?" Harry Quong asked. He looked at his watch. 1700. There wasn't time for a visit to Zortolk's old fort, 10 miles to the north at the next pass. Back to Konkrook to the island. The nose of the car swung east by south. The cold jet rotors began humming, and then the hot jets were cut in. The car turned from the fort and the mountains and shot away over the foothills toward the coastal plain. Below were forests, yellow-green with new foliage of the second growing season of the equatorial year, veined with narrow dirt roads and spotted with occasional clearings. Farther east, the dirty gray wood smoke of Uller marked the progress of the charcoal burnings. It took 40 years to burn the forest clear back to the flint cliffs. By the time the burners reached the mountains, the new trees at the seaward edge would be ready to cut. Off to the south he could see the dark green squares where the hemlocks and the Norway spruce had been planted by the company. With a little chemical fertilizer they were doing well, and they made better charcoal than the silicate-heavy native wood. That was the only natural fuel on Uller. There was no coal, of course, since fallen timber and even standing dead trees petrified in a matter of a couple of years. There was too much silica on Uller and not enough of anything else. What would be coal seams on Terra were strata of silicified wood, and of course there was no petroleum. There was less charcoal being burned now than formerly. The Uller Company had been bringing in great quantities of synthetic thermoconcentrate fuel, and had been setting up nuclear furnaces and nuclear electric power plants wherever they gained a foothold on the planet. Beyond the forests came the farmlands. Around the older estates, thick walls of flint and petrified wood had been built, wide moats dug to keep out the shellosaurs. But now the moats were dry and the walls falling into disrepair. Some of the newer farms, land devoted to agriculture,